Welcome to History's Mysteries, a place where the echoes of the past linger in the quiet of night. Here, forgotten worlds awaken softly, and the stories of time unfold like dreams. So settle in, breathe deeply, and let history whisper you to sleep.
The silent cathedrals of time, abandoned temples of forgotten faiths. By the time the world forgot the gods, their houses were already crumbling. Stone gives way slowly, more slowly than memory, so that the last worshipper may die centuries before the last column falls. Wind and rain go on whispering the names no one speaks, polishing the steps no one climbs. In that interval, between the fading of a faith and the collapse of its last sanctuary, something strange happens. Temples become cathedrals of time. I did not set out to find them. At least, that is what I said to myself the first night, when the airplane window showed a black ocean and a thin curve of moon, and the engine's hum merged with the ache behind my eyes. I told friends that I was doing research on comparative religion, on the archaeology of forgotten cults. It sounded polite, academic, respectable, but the truth is that I was tired of quick opinions and faster vanishing headlines, of gods that lasted 3 seasons of a streaming show and then were replaced. Tired of the way even the great religions, the living ones, were argued over like brands. Somewhere under that weariness was an impulse I could not quite name, a need to listen to something older than the noise. So I followed rumors, footnotes, and half-legible translations. I followed the way a strange name glows on a page, the way embers glow in ashes. I followed flights and buses and dirt roads, until one morning the sun hauled itself over a desert horizon, and I saw the first of the silent cathedrals. It rose from the plateau like a piece of dawn that had hardened into stone. From a distance the temple looked simple. 4 square walls and a flat roof, all of it carved from a pale glass-sheened rock that caught the light and scattered it. Up close, the simplicity dissolved into intricacy. Every surface was etched with lines so fine they were almost invisible. Rays, arcs, spirals, intersecting at strange angles. At first I thought of stars, then of something older than stars. My guide, a taciturn man in a sand-colored scarf, stopped the jeep a respectful distance from the ruins. "We go on foot," he said. "The road ends here." And he searched for a word in English. "Voices." "What kind of voices?" I asked. He lifted one shoulder. "Place remembers. Some people hear it, some do not." His eyes flicked to mine. "You're the kind who hears, I think." The air tasted of dust and light. Heat was already uncoiling off the ground. The wind was cool and carried a faint metallic tang, like old coins. As we walked, the temple shifted subtly with each step, its edges blurring, like something seen underwater. Mirages wobbled on the horizon, but this structure remained unnervingly clear, unnervingly present. Up close, I saw that the entrance was a low, narrow slit, no taller than my shoulder. Above it, carved into the stone lintel, was a symbol, a circle broken in 3 places, with a tiny inverted triangle at its heart. "You know the name of this place?" I asked my guide. "It has no name," he said. "Or rather, too many. The old stories." He waved a hand. "Sky Temple, House of the First Light, Shrine of the Goddess who turned away." People tell stories when they see something they do not understand. You don't believe any of them? He thought about it. I believe the stone. It is older than the stories. Stories follow stone, not the other way. Inside, the temperature dropped sharply. The light, instead of fading, seemed to thicken, turning the air into something like pale honey. The hall beyond the entrance was narrow and long, its walls converging toward a point of brightness at the far end. My footsteps sounded small and disrespectful. Thin grooves ran along the floor, so shallow they were almost smooth. Where they met the walls, the etchings there flared into cascades of lines that curved around each other in dedications to geometry I could not read. "It's like a sundial," I murmured, tracing one line with my fingertip. The stone felt unexpectedly warm, as if heat were running inside it like blood. But inside, underground. "Not a sundial," said a voice from the shadows ahead. "At least, not for this sun." I started so violently I almost fell. My guide merely inclined his head, as though he had been expecting this. A man stepped out from the bright haze at the end of the hall. He wore clothes that could have been taken from any era, a plain dark coat, trousers tucked into scuffed boots, a wide-brimmed hat whose shape refused to settle on a century. There was nothing remarkable about his face, except that, like his clothes, it would not stay still in my mind. Every time I looked away and back, I was sure he had been younger, or older, or differently shaped around the eyes. "I'm sorry," I said, heart still thudding. I was told no one lived out here." "No one does," he said. "I only keep watch." He extended a hand. "You can call me the keeper, if it helps." "Of what?" I asked automatically. "Of dust, of stories, of the places in between." His hand was warm and dry, his grip both firm and oddly weightless, as though he might drift away if I let go. "You've come to listen, haven't you?" I hesitated. "To learn, perhaps." "Learning is a species of listening," he said. "Come." We walked together down the narrowing hall. My guide stayed at the entrance, muttering something under his breath that might have been a prayer. The grooves in the floor deepened, and the lines on the walls grew denser, overlapping until they formed a shimmering lattice that hurt my eyes. "There was a faith here once," the keeper said conversationally. "They had no word for God, only for the one who was before. They believed the sky was a wound in the body of the universe, and that light was blood spilling through." "That's vivid," I said. "They were vivid people. They measured that blood with great care." He touched the wall with his fingertips, and for an instant the lines around his hand flared, like embers stirred by a breath. "They carved the paths of suns you've never seen. They charted the turning of stars that were old when this planet was gas and fire. Time for them was not a river, but a cathedral. Rooms within rooms, all resonant at different frequencies. This place," his hand described a small arc taking in the hall, the temple, the blazing sky beyond, "was their tuning fork." We reached the far end of the hall. Instead of a sanctum or altar, there was a circular chamber open to the sky. The roof had been cut away, or perhaps it had never existed. Walls rose in a smooth curve, their surfaces carved with spiraling grooves that all led upward, converging on the ragged circle of blue. In the center of the floor, a shallow basin of the same glass-like stone held a faint trace of darkness, like a shadow that had run out of substance. There were no statues, no offerings, no relics. They worshipped time? I asked. In a sense. The keeper tilted his head back, eyes half closed against the glare. They worshipped the before, the possibility that what came first still vibrates through what came after, that by listening just right, they could hear the first note. And did they? He smiled faintly. For a while. Every faith hears its God for a while. That is how faith survives its birth. But there are no temples in this world whose worshippers do not eventually stop listening. The miracle is not that faiths die. He touched the basin with the back of his knuckles. It is that their houses remain, long enough to remember for them. A gust of wind swept into the chamber, bringing with it the smell of far-off rain. For an instant, the basin darkened, and I thought I saw movement there. Not a reflection of the sky, but of something deeper. A skyscape in which the stars were arranged in unfamiliar constellations, an ink-blue firmament streaked with slow, luminous rivers. Then the wind passed, and the illusion with it. What happened to them? I asked. People who built this place? What happens to all such people? The keeper said softly. The sky changed, slowly, then all at once. The wound shifted. Blood fell differently. Their measurements ceased to match the world. They had poured themselves into this tuning fork, and the note it gave back no longer fit. Some tried to adjust. Some clung to the old patterns, insisting the sky was wrong, not they. Some walked out into the desert and followed the receding constellations until they died of thirst, still counting. And the temple? The stone stayed. Long after the last believer lay forgotten in the sand, the grooves remained. The walls continued to sing in the language of a sky that no longer existed. He opened his hands as if balancing invisible weights. No one listened, and yet time listened. It always does. That is when these places become what they are now, the silent cathedrals. Silent? I echoed. It doesn't feel silent. He glanced at me. You hear them then? What are they saying? That depends on who you are when you arrive, he said, and who you will be when you leave. We stood together in the strange, cool light, listening to something that was not exactly sound. It was like feeling the pulse in your wrist, a rhythm that had always been there, but which you notice only when you stop and pay attention. Images rose unbidden in my mind. Generations kneeling on this stone, eyes raised to a long-gone sky, hands tracing grooves into rock with patient tools, a child pressing her ear to the basin to hear the echo of stars. The feeling was not reverence so much as recognition. The people who had prayed here were gone, their God silent, their sky replaced. The hunger that had built this temple, the hunger to locate themselves in something vast and enduring, felt familiar. After some unmeasured time, the keeper touched my elbow. Come, he said, there are other cathedrals. Time is patient, but your body is not. You will need food, water, sleep. You're coming with me? I asked. For a while, until we reached the next one. His smile was wry. Besides, you may not find them without me. They do not appear on maps the way you think. On the drive back, my guide muttered about spirits and omens, and kindly but firmly refused my offer of extra payment if he would agree to take us to the second site. This is as far as I go, he said, hand tightening on the steering wheel. You want more old stones? Talk to your friend. My friend. I turned, but the keeper, who had sat in the jeep's shadow and spoken quietly with me moments before, was nowhere to be seen. Desert stretched unbroken on every side, shimmering with heat. He left, my guide said with a shrug. People like that, they come and go. You will see him again, if you're meant to. I almost protested that no one could have walked away into that open vastness without kicking up dust or leaving footprints. Instead, I closed my mouth, buckled my seatbelt, and watched the tempo recede in the rearview mirror. The sun climbed higher, turning the pale stone into a white flame against the sky. And then it was gone. For a time, my life seemed to resume its usual shape. There were hotel rooms and flights, emails and receipts, snippets of ordinary conversation. The memory of the desert temple faded at the edges, like a vivid dream. But I noticed myself pausing longer than necessary in museums, lingering in the rooms devoted to unknown cult, 3rd century BCE, or ritual object, culture undetermined. I found my eyes tracing the cracks in old statues, wondering what vibrations still lived in their stone. It was in a museum, in fact, that I saw the second cathedral. It was not the cathedral itself, of course. It lay many thousands of miles away, in a jungle I had never imagined visiting. It was a fragment, a borrowed piece, set behind glass with a neat label. Carved stone panel. Provenance: unknown river valley civilization, predating regional records. Symbolic imagery suggests ritual significance. The panel was no larger than a laptop screen, its edges worn and chipped. It showed a stylized archway surmounted by coiling vines, and beyond it a series of steps descending into waves. Above the arch, etched in delicate lines, was the same broken circle I had seen over the desert temple's door. Only here, the inverted triangle at its heart had been replaced with a tiny curling spiral. A small note at the bottom of the placard read, "Similar motifs found at submerged temple complex. Coordinates on file with research department." I stood there long enough that a security guard ambled over to ask if I was alright. "Fine," I said, but my voice sounded distant to my own ears. Could you tell me where these coordinates are? The submerged complex?" He gestured toward the help desk. "Ask there, but I doubt they'll give you that kind of information." They did not. The woman at the desk smiled apologetically and spoke of preservation, safety, the need for permits. I nodded and thanked her, and later that night, in the quiet of my hotel room, I searched for the fragment's accession number in academic databases. There were papers, of course there were papers, discussing the river enclosure site, its puzzling isolation, its curious iconography. There were also, buried deeper, references to a certain independent consultant who sometimes appeared in field reports under titles like temporal site verification or non-standard chronology assessment. The name listed was not the keeper, of course, but the initials were the same. By that point, I was no longer pretending, even to myself, that I had stumbled into this. When you have heard a stone sing, you do not return easily to silence. The jungle was nothing like the desert, and yet they shared a certain density of time. In the desert, time lay exposed, flat and immense, unrumpled by foliage. In the jungle it grew in layers, leaf over leaf, vine over branch, fallen tree over stone. Every inch of ground seemed occupied by roots or rot or new growth, and the air hummed with insects and hidden birds. The boat that carried me upriver was a narrow wooden thing, its small engine coughing now and then in protest. The water was the color of old copper, opaque and slow-moving, carrying leaves, twigs, and the occasional startled fish. The local guide this time was a woman, older than my desert companion, her face cross-hatched with fine lines. She did not speak English, but she watched me with curious, amused eyes. We had been traveling for several hours when the river widened and the current slackened. The guide cut the engine and let the boat drift. Ahead, the water swirled around something that broke the surface, the corner of a stone block, slick with algae, its top just barely visible. "Altar," the guide said, tapping the stone with her paddle. Then she pointed beyond it, to where the river darkened. House below. A submerged temple lay entirely beneath the waterline, a drowned structure whose outlines could only be guessed at from the way the current moved. Here the river ran strangely cool, and when I trailed my fingers over the side, I felt not the solid resistance of expected depth, but an almost dizzying drop, as if the riverbed had fallen away into a chasm. I stared into the brown-green water, focusing past the reflections of clouds, until shapes began to emerge, steps worn by countless feet descending into darkness, columns wrapped in trailing plants, carved reliefs of human figures, their faces eroded but their gestures intact, hands raised, not upward, but outward toward the river itself. "Goddess of the flood?" I guessed aloud. The guide shook her head, lips pulling back in something that was almost a smile and almost a grimace. "New goddess," she said slowly, searching for a word. Door? The river was a door. The temple was a hinge. The faithful had not come to appease some personified spirit of the water. They had come to slide open a passage between states. This much I could feel, and the way the hairs on my arms rose and the boat drifted over the submerged stairs. "You won't see much from here," said a voice at my shoulder. "The river is shy in the daytime." I did not start as violently as I had in the desert. Some part of me had been listening for that voice since I first saw the stone panel in the museum. "You're late," I said without turning. "Time is difficult to measure in places like this," the keeper replied. When I looked at him, he was sitting cross-legged in the stern of the boat, hat tipped back, bare feet trailing in the water. His coat was gone. He wore a short-sleeved shirt whose fabric clung damply to his arms. Beads of moisture glittered on his skin like tiny pearls. Besides, the river likes to decide these things. The guide did not appear to notice him. She sat at the bow, paddle resting across her knees, humming under her breath. "Is she?" I began. "She sees enough," the keeper said. "Not in the way you do, not in the way I do, but she has ferried archaeologists and pilgrims up this river for many years. She knows where it folds." "Folds?" He dipped his hand in the water, making small ripples. "Do you know how cloth bends when you gather it? Time does that too. Certain acts, repeated with enough belief, enough attention, can pinch the fabric of years. Shrines are often built at such pinches. Every prayer, every offering, tightens the fold, drawing different eras closer, until—" He snapped his fingers lightly. "You have a place where moments seep between centuries, very useful for those who wish to speak with their dead, or their gods, or their unborn descendants. And when no one comes anymore—" "Ah," he smiled. "And the fold does not simply straighten. It cannot. It is knotted now, like muscle grown around an old wound. The shrine falls silent, but the bend remains. Such places are resonant. Time eats its own tail there in small, strange ways. We drifted over the submerged stairs again. This time, as I gazed down, the brown-green murk cleared for a heartbeat. I saw not just steps and shadows, but flickers of movement. People in garments woven from reeds, bearing clay jars. A procession of children scattering flower petals into the current. A woman with braided hair kneeling on the lowest step, arms spread as if to embrace the water. For an instant, her eyes rose to meet mine, and they held a grief so vast it cracked something in my chest. Then a leaf bumped against the side of the boat. The water clouded, and the vision dissolved. "Did you see that?" I whispered. "Yes," the keeper said quietly. "Who was she?" "Once, she was their doorkeeper. She knew the currents by taste, the moods of the river by the way it curved around her knees. When the tides of their history turned, she stood here and watched their world drown. There was nothing she could sacrifice that would have stopped it. The flood was not a god's wrath or a moral lesson. It was an upstream glacier melting, a tectonic plate shuddering. And yet, because she was keeper of the door, she felt responsible." "She still feels responsible," I said, my throat tight. "Time does not forgive as easily as you think," he said. "It does not punish either. It simply remembers, and in remembering, it holds certain gestures in place." The guide spoke then, in rapid phrases I could not follow, and pointed toward the shore. A tangle of roots and moss there concealed a narrow opening, a dark slit in the river bank. "Side door," the keeper said. "Come." The cave was damp, close, dripping with the slow patience of minerals. We walked single file, our flashlights picking out glistening stone formations and pale blind insects. The air smelled of earth, something else, a faint metallic tang, as if the river's blood had seeped into the rock. The passage widened abruptly into a cavern, whose ceiling was strung with stalactites, like petrified fangs. The floor sloped gently down toward a still pool. Its surface was so smooth it might have been stone, but when I stepped closer, I saw my reflection shiver. Around the pool's rim, set into the rock, were carvings, the same archway motif I'd seen on the museum panel, repeated and varied. Some arches opened onto stylized waves, others onto curling clouds, others onto blankness. "This," said the keeper, "was their inner temple. Here they made their exchanges." Exchanges? Memories for omens, promises for postponements. You would call it prayer, they called it bargaining. I knelt at the edge of the pool. In its still depths, the reflection of the cave roof seemed impossibly far away, as if the water opened into a vertical shaft rather than a shallow basin. When I reached out, intending to test its depth, the keeper's hand closed gently around my wrist. "Careful," he said. "This place is not as abandoned as it looks." As if to confirm that, a drop of water fell from a stalactite and hit the pool with a soft plink. Rings spread outward, distorting my reflection. For an instant, I saw not my own face, but a rapid sequence of others. A man with ritual scars across his cheeks, a girl with hair braided in riverine patterns, an old woman whose eyes were filmed with cataracts, but whose gaze still burned. "Are those the worshippers?" I asked, shaking. "In a way." The keeper released my wrist. Little echoes, trapped in the knot of time here. When you remember someone intensely, you bind them into your personal past. When enough people remember together, they carve a kind of channel through time, and those people are gone, but the place remains. The channel can fill with reflections. Ghosts, I said, if you like, but not in the sense of spirits with unfinished business. Think of them as habits of memory the world itself has developed. These are places where time remembers how it was used. I thought of the river temple, visible only as broken outlines beneath the surface, of the woman on the steps, whose grief still vibrated in my bones. "Why show me this?" I whispered. "Why are you bringing me to these cathedrals?" The keeper crouched beside me. The pool's dim light picked out small lines around his eyes that I did not recall seeing before. "Because you are listening," he said. "Because you're tired of noise and hungry for the deeper hum beneath it. Because there is a danger in forgetting that everything you think is permanent will one day be a drowned stare or a desert groove, and yet the imprint of your gestures will endure. Because some stories are only complete when someone agrees to carry them forward, not as dogma, but as understanding." He dipped 2 fingers into the water. For a moment the pool darkened, and in its depths I saw, not the past, but something that might have been the future. The same river, narrower, its banks choked with plastic and rusting metal, skyscrapers rising in the hazy distance, a small child peering into a muddy puddle between broken concrete slabs, her expression filled with the same aching curiosity I had felt in the desert temple. Then the vision passed. "This is the second cathedral," the keeper said softly. "There will be others. There is a monastery in the mountains that erased its own scriptures. There is a city underneath a city where every faith burned itself into frescoes no one can read. There is a temple above the clouds, and one below the ice." "And you keep them all?" I asked. "I visit," he said. "I listen. I speak when someone comes with the right kind of questions. Call it keeping, if you like. Time does not need a custodian, but humans often do." He rose and held out a hand. "You are not done yet. The path is long." As I took his hand and let him lead me back through the dripping cave, the sense of walking not just through space, but through a thickening weave of years settled around me like a cloak. The silent cathedrals of time were not just ruins. They were mirrors in which my own era, my own restless, distracted age, might someday be reflected as a faint, shimmering image. Somewhere in an unimaginable future, a stranger might press their hand to a cracked screen or fragment of printed page and feel a faint echo of our questions. The thought was both humbling and strangely comforting. When we emerged from the cave into the blind white glare of day, the river roared past as if it had never paused. The guide shaded her eyes, looked at me, and nodded once, as if something had been decided. "You are not the first to come," the keeper said, "and you will not be the last. Time is generous with its invitations, even if most people decline without knowing they were asked." "How many more are there?" I asked. His smile held both mischief and sorrow. "Enough." We boarded the boat. The current took us, carrying us back towards settlements and roads and the thin skein of Wi-Fi that stitched the modern world together. But I felt as though a deeper current had caught me, one that flowed not just from upriver to downriver, but from before to after, from forgotten to not yet known. The silent cathedrals were waiting, their stones patient, their drowned steps steady under the weight of water. Somewhere in mountain air or city dust, other forgotten faiths had left their houses standing, not to demand worship, but to offer remembrance. I did not yet know their names, but time and the keeper would show me. And so the journey went on. The mountains greeted me with thin air and a silence that felt sharper than any I had known in desert or jungle. On the map, the region was a tangle of contour lines and sparse place names, a high range straddling the border between languages, between climates, between histories. Travelers came here to climb, to trek, to stand on ridges and take photographs of themselves against distant peaks. Very few came for the monastery that lay tucked in a side valley, several days' journey from the nearest marked trail. By then, I had learned that the world's forgotten sanctuaries seldom appeared where brochures suggested. The path up to the monastery wound through forests of stunted pines and over scree slopes, where every step sent small avalanches of stones clattering into the ravine below. My guide this time was a wiry young man with a calm smile and a habit of humming tunelessly under his breath. He had never heard of the place I described, but when I showed him my hand-drawn map, a composite of hints from old journals, expedition reports, and a half-deciphered inscription from the museum cellar, his eyes widened. My grandfather spoke of such a place, he said. The monastery that turned its back on the world. He said the monks there erased their own words. I thought it only a story to frighten children into finishing their lessons. We camped in the last scraps of tree line, where the wind combed the grass in restless waves. Stars came out in brittle, dazzling profusion. It was too cold for many insects, and the quiet was so complete that the crackle of the campfire sounded like distant thunder. I lay awake long after my guide's breathing had settled into the slow rhythm of sleep. Above me, the Milky Way arched like a pale scar across the sky. I thought of the desert temples' vanished constellations, of the river's remembered rituals, and wondered what kind of wound or healing had taken place in the monastery we were approaching. "You are closer than you think," said a voice from the darkness. I turned my head. The keeper sat at the edge of the firelight, hat in his hands, boots dusted with a thin sheen of frost. The light from the embers painted hollows under his cheekbones, and his eyes reflected the flames in pinpoints of gold. "You never seem to be out of breath," I said, "or hungry, or tired." "I get what I need in other places," he said, "not in ways you would find comforting." He tilted his head back to regard the stars. "This is a good sky. It belongs to more than one faith." "What do you mean?" "Think of all the pilgrims who walked under it," he said. "Followers of mountain gods and sun gods, hermits and poets, saints and skeptics, men and women who climbed these paths with hearts full of prayers, and others who simply came seeking a quiet hour away from the noise below. They all looked up. They all saw these stars. Whatever names they gave that experience, the light itself was common currency." "And the monastery?" I asked. "What did they see?" "For a long time, too long perhaps, they saw only their own reflections," he said. "Come, sleep if you can. Tomorrow you will see what's left." Morning was a slow unfurling of light over peaks and ridges. We packed our tent with numb fingers and set out along a narrow path that clung to the mountainside like a thought that would not fully form. The air grew thinner with each step, and my breath came in short, painful pulls. Then the trail rounded a shoulder of rock, and the monastery revealed itself. It clung to the cliff face as if grown from it, a cluster of stone buildings with sloping roofs, their wooden beams silvered with age. A long stairway, partly carved into the rock and partly constructed from rough-hewn blocks, led up to a heavy wooden gate. Colourful prayer flags once stretched from the roofs to poles sunk into the cliff, but time and weather had shredded them into faint, faded streamers. As we approached, my guide slowed, then stopped altogether. "I will not go further," he said, eyes fixed on the gate. "This place has a feeling. I do not like it." "You believe the stories your grandfather told, then?" I asked. "I believe my bones," he said simply. "They say no. I will wait here. If you do not return by sunset, I will go down and speak your name at the village shrine." "Is that a blessing?" I asked, attempting a smile. "It is whatever you need it to be," he replied gravely. I left him there and climbed the steps alone. Each one felt slightly different in height, as if they had been carved by many hands over many years, each mason making subtle adjustments based on his own stride. The air smelled of stone dust and old incense. The gate stood ajar. There was no lock, no chain, no sign forbidding entry. Only an absence, as if the building itself had drawn in a breath and never let it go. I stepped inside. The courtyard was larger than I'd expected, framed by cloistered walkways and low buildings. Empty flagpoles rattled softly in the wind. A well sat at its center, its stone lip worn smooth beyond the far wall. The night winds reared up, staggering in their indifference. This was not always an abandoned place, the keeper said, appearing beside the well, as if he had stepped out of my shadow. His breath did not smoke in the cold air. Mine did. "I gathered that much," I said. "They were devout, you know," he went on. "Devout in the way only those convinced of their own smallness can be. Their faith taught that words were traps, but to name the divine was to limit it. And so they praised their God in paradoxes and silence, in gestures and patterns. For centuries, this worked very well." We walked along the cloister. The walls were painted with murals, but at first glance they seemed nothing more than foggy smears of grey, brown, and faded blue. Figures emerged only when I looked closely. Kneeling monks, mountain spirits, stylized flames. All of them had been partially obscured by later brushstrokes of white, as if someone had tried to erase the images without quite succeeding. "What happened?" I asked. "The same thing that happens to any system devoted to purity," the keeper said quietly. "They turned inward. They began to fear contamination, not from enemies or outsiders, but from their own thoughts. Each time someone tried to articulate a teaching, another would point out the limitation in those words. Each attempt to praise their God was discovered to be inadequate, insulting even once examined. They became obsessed with erasing their own mistakes." He gestured toward the murals. "These are not the work of iconoclasts from outside. This is the work of the monks themselves. They painted their vision of heaven, then repented for having dared to depict it, and covered it in white. They wrote hymns, then burned them for having presumed to describe the indescribable." We entered a long hall whose walls were lined with shelves. At least they had once been. Now most of the shelves were empty, their wood carved with shallow repetitive grooves, where scrolls or books had once rested. A few scraps of parchment lay scattered on the floor, their ink washed into illegibility by water or time. Eventually, the keeper said, they ceased creating and devoted themselves entirely to uncreating. They studied their own archives only to hunt for error. When they found what they deemed a dangerous phrase, they scraped it off the page and carefully recorded the act of scraping in another volume, which they would later also condemn as presumptuous and destroy. They saw this as a kind of holy pruning. They believed that if they removed every impure thought, what remained would be pure awareness. What remained? I asked, already knowing the answer. He spread his hands toward the empty shelves. They succeeded more completely than they intended. Their books are gone, their paintings obscured, their music forgotten. The last generation left behind detailed instructions for erasing even their own names. And yet the monastery stands, I said. Yes. He looked at me with something like pride. For all their efforts to disentangle themselves from history, they left a very clear imprint on time. Their devotion to erasure became, ironically, the most indelible part of their legacy. That is why this place is one of the cathedrals. I ran my fingers over the nearest shelf. The grooves in the wood felt oddly familiar, like an echo of the desert temple's lines and the river shrine's arches. Do they haunt it? I asked. The monks? Not in the way you mean. He led me to the far end of the hall, where a single book remained on a pedestal, wrapped in rotting cloth. Their ghosts are not personalities, but practices watch. He did not touch the book. Instead, he blew gently across its surface. Dust rose like smoke, swirling in the slanting light from a high window. For a moment, the particles hung in the air in patterns. Letters, words, sentences in a script I did not recognize. They seemed to form, hesitate, and then, as if ashamed of their own daring, disperse. Even now, the keeper murmured, the habit of erasure persists. This building has a reflex against being pinned down. Is there anything left of what they believed? I asked. Any trace of their God? Their teachings? He thought for a long moment. They believed that the divine was what remained when you let go of every image, every idea, every story, he said at last. In that sense, their God is everywhere there is silence, here especially. We stood and listened. The silence was not empty. It was dense with things unsaid, with words that had once hung in the air and been carefully disassembled. It felt like standing in a library after a great fire, the phantom of knowledge lingering like heat on the walls. In that silence, I heard, faintly, the murmuring of my own age, the constant production of commentary, the endless stream of opinions, the fear of missing a moment, a trend, a phrase. For a heartbeat, I felt a fierce kinship with those monks, their longing to carve away the unnecessary to reveal something essential beneath. But I also saw their mistake. In their zeal to purify, they had cut themselves away not only from error, but from relationship. Their faith had become a mirror turned on itself until it reflected nothing at all. That is why it is valuable as a cathedral, the keeper said quietly, as if reading my thoughts. Not because they were right or wrong, but because they show one way a human longing can twist when taken to its extreme. Time remembers such experiments. We left the hall and climbed a narrow stair to the rooftop. From there, the view was staggering. Mountains rising in serried ranks, valleys dropping away into blue haze, the sky an immense translucent bowl overhead. Wind tugged at my clothes and slipped cold fingers into my hair. Once, they came up here to watch the dawn, the keeper said. They believed that if they could greet the first light without a single word arising in their minds, they would be free of all illusions. Did anyone succeed? I asked. He smiled. You tell me. We stood together as a cloud parted, and a shaft of sunlight slid across a distant peak, igniting it in gold. For a moment, all the stories fell away. Desert temples and drowned shrines, erased scriptures and coming ruins. There was only light on rock, and the thin, sweet sting of air in my lungs. No words came, or rather many did, but they felt redundant. The experience was already complete. After a long time, the keeper spoke again. You see, even here, in the ruins of their excess, there is something to learn, not as a dogma, but as a perspective. These places remember not only their builders' mistakes, but their glimpses of understanding. Is that why you call them cathedrals? I asked. I rarely call them anything, he said. You were the one who named them that, in your notes after the desert temple. Silent cathedrals of time. I liked the phrase. I stared at him. You read my notes? He shrugged. You leave them in places easy to find, on screens, in notebooks, in the backs of your thoughts. Time has a way of catching such things. His expression softened. Names matter. They shape how you attend to the world. You could have called these ruins dead religions or failed cults. You chose cathedrals of time. That tells me something about what you're ready to hear. And what is that? I asked. That you're beginning to see faith not as a set of answers, but as an ongoing conversation with what exceeds you, he said. And that you're ready to see how the conversation continues even after the words have been forgotten. We descended from the roof. As we left the monastery, I felt the silence stretch behind us, like a held breath finally released. My guide was waiting where I had left him, sitting on a rock and tossing small stones into the ravine. When he saw me, relief softened his features. You went very still, he said. Even from here, I could feel it. Did you ever think of becoming a monk? I asked impulsively. He laughed. No. I like food and songs too much. My grandfather says a faith that forgets to dance is sick. We began the long journey back to the world of roads and networks. The mountains slowly receded behind us, their white peaks bright against the sky. Days folded into weeks. My life became a series of thresholds. Airport gates, station platforms, border crossings. Between each, a cathedral. There was the underground city, discovered beneath a modern metropolis when workers digging a new subway tunnel broke through into a frescoed chamber. Officially, it was sealed off for preservation. Unofficially, the keeper and I slipped in one damp evening, our flashlights catching gleams of gold and pigment on walls that told stories in a dozen styles. Here, a serpent god devouring its tail circled a Christian saint. There, a wheel of reincarnation turned beneath a crescent moon. Generations of conquerors had painted over each other's symbols, only for the next to do the same, until the walls were a palimpsest of devotion and triumph, fear and hope. No single faith remained intact. The cathedral there was not to a god, but to the human urge to inscribe meaning on stone. There was the cavern beneath a glacier, reachable only by crawling through a tunnel of blue ice. The air inside was so cold it burned. At its heart lay a ring of standing stones, slick with ancient frost, their arrangement calculated to catch the pale light filtering through the ice above. People who had built it were long gone, their culture obliterated by shifting climate and migrating beasts. But on certain days of the year, the keeper told me, the light still aligned perfectly, pouring down in a column that turned the frozen air into liquid gold. A cathedral, he said to patients. There was a small island in a great lake, occupied now only by birds. Once, a temple there had housed a statue of a god of echoes and returns. Now, only the pedestal remained, its surface colonized by moss. When the wind blew just right between the rocks, the sound of the waves striking the shore resolved into something like chanting, a low, repetitive murmur that seemed to answer itself. Each place left an imprint on me, a texture, a mood, a question. Gradually, my sense of time shifted. The present felt less like a point on a line and more like a room in a vast building, connected by doorways to other rooms, some bright, some dark, some piled with forgotten furniture, others bare and echoing. One evening, as we sat on a hill overlooking a city whose lights spread out like spilled jewels, I asked the keeper, "Do the cathedrals ever end? Is there a last one?" "There is a last one for you," he said. "Time is long, your life is not. At some point, your body will say, 'Enough.'" "And for you?" I ventured. "Do they end for you?" He smiled in a way that made him look for a heartbeat, very tired. "I am not bound to time the way you are," he said, "but that does not mean I am free of it. I am. An arrangement it has tried on. One of the ways it has chosen to speak to itself. When I am no longer needed, I will unravel. Something else will take my place." "That sounds lonely," I said. "Loneliness is just a name for a certain arrangement of attention," he replied. "When you're listening deeply, you're never truly alone." The last cathedral he showed me did not yet exist, or rather, it existed in more than one sense, folded into a knot of time I could only glimpse from the corner of my mind's eye. We met in a field on the outskirts of a sprawling city, under a sky lit not by stars, but by a dull orange haze. The air smelled of exhaust and distant rain. Construction cranes stood like skeletal fingers against the horizon. "There," the keeper said, pointing toward a cluster of unfinished towers. "Look." I looked. At first, I saw only the obvious: concrete pillars, steel girders, glass panels reflecting the murky sky. Then, as I let my gaze soften, other images began to seep through. A soaring hall of light and shadow, its walls lined not with stone carvings, but with screens, 1,000 small rectangles, each displaying a different pattern of color and motion. People moved through the hall, their faces lit from below by the pale glow of devices in their hands. Some knelt, not before statues, but before abstract diagrams, immersive projections of data streams and orbits. Others sat in silence, eyes closed, listening to a hum that seemed to rise from the very bones of the building. "This is a temple?" I asked, startled. "In one branch of possibility," the keeper said, "a sanctuary built for a faith that has not yet fully named itself. A faith in human continuity, perhaps, or in consciousness as a pattern that can be stored and reassembled. They will call it many things. Some will come here believing they can pray themselves into servers. Others will come simply because it is quiet and beautiful. In the vision, I saw a child standing at the center of the hall, looking up at a ceiling that displayed a simulation of the universe. Galaxies wheeling in slow, stately arcs around her, murmured debates about ethics and personhood, identity and replication, rose and fell like incense. What happens to it? I asked. What happens to all temples? The keeper said. It flourishes, it divides, is fought over, defended, abandoned. Its screens go dark when the power grid fails. Its servers decay. Moisture seeps into its walls. Centuries later, someone stands where you're standing now, staring at a fragment of its architecture protruding from a hillside, and wonders what those people believed. My chest tightened. Then why show it to me? Because you live nearer to this possibility than to those we have seen, he said gently. Because your choices, collective, not individual, will help determine whether this future faith is born gentle or cruel, inclusive or exclusive, attuned to the rest of the world, or sealed in its own hall of mirrors. And the cathedral, I whispered, will it be one too? Oh, yes, his eyes shone with a sober kind of joy. Time will remember it, as it remembers all the places where humans try to speak with what they did not fully understand. It will be one of the silent cathedrals someday, just as your era's screens and towers will be. I am showing you so that, when you walk through your own temples, be they churches or offices, data centers or shopping malls, you will feel the weight of that continuity. The vision faded. The half-built towers stood in the orange glow, skeletal and ordinary. I looked at the keeper. So, what am I meant to do with all this? I asked. I'm just one person. I've seen deserts and rivers, ice and stone, future screens and past walls. I've listened, like you said. But what now? Now, he said, you remember, when you feel tempted to declare that your own time is uniquely enlightened or uniquely doomed, you remember these cathedrals. When you hear people speak with contempt of those who believe differently, you recall the care with which they carved stone, the patience with which they aligned their devotions to stars or rivers or empty air. When you yourself feel the tug toward erasing what you once held dear, you remember the monastery and ask whether you are pruning or cutting your own roots. That doesn't sound like much, I said. It is not spectacular, he agreed, but it is how time stays honest with itself. It is also how you stay human in the face of your own impermanence. We walked in silence for a while, our footsteps crunching on gravel. The city's noise grew as we approached, a wash of engines and sirens, voices and vibrations. Somewhere a billboard flickered, its advertisement briefly glitching into a pattern of static that looked for an instant like a broken circle with a triangle at its heart. I stopped. That symbol, I said. I've seen it in every place we visited. Desert temple, river shrine, glacier cave, underground city. What is it? He followed my gaze, then smiled. An old sigil, one of time's little jokes, perhaps, or one of the ways humans across ages and cultures have tried to draw the feeling of being between things. The circle broken, the point suspended in the center. Between what? I asked. Between before and after, he said, between knowing and not knowing, between worship and forgetting. The cathedrals all stand in such in-between places, so do you. You too, I said. He inclined his head. So do I. We reached a busy intersection. Pedestrians surged around us, each carrying a world of private rituals and unspoken beliefs. No one seemed to notice the thin, slightly out-of-place man at my side, or the way the light around him did not quite behave like the light around anyone else. "This is where we part, for now," he said. "Will I see you again?" I asked. He considered. "In a way, you see me whenever you stand in an old doorway and feel the weight of years, whenever you touch a relic and sense that you're not the first to love or fear it, whether I am there as a person, in this shape." He shrugged. "Time will decide." I wanted to ask more about his origins, his nature, the mechanics of his appearances, but I had visited enough cathedrals by then to recognize that some doors should remain half open. Their power lay not in neat explanations, but in the spaces they left for wonder. Instead, I said, "Thank you for guiding me." "It is what I am arranged to do," he replied. Then softer, "And it has been pleasant. Not everyone who comes to these places listens as you have. Not everyone asks questions without demanding answers that fit in their pockets." He stepped back. The crowd flowed between us, a river of bodies. For an instant, his hat rose above the sea of heads like a small, dark boat. Then it was gone. I stood there in the heart of a living city, listening. Under the honk of horns and the buzz of electricity, I heard other sounds, the distant ring of a chisel on stone, the slap of river water against steps, the rasp of a brush scraping away pigment, the low chant of voices rising in a room lit by screens and stars. All of it was time, speaking in different registers. All of it was prayer, in a sense. Even the atheist's careful experiment, the skeptic's diligent question, the child's repetition of a rhyme she did not yet understand. Later, I would return to my work, framing what I had seen in words that could be printed, archived, argued over. Some readers would call it myth, others metaphor, others perhaps hallucination. That was all right. The cathedrals did not need belief. They had stone and water, ice and data, wind and light. They had the long, slow attention of time itself. But when I sat down to write, I began with a simple sentence, one that had grown in me over the miles and years. There are buildings that remember us better than we remember ourselves. From there, the stories unfolded, of deserts and rivers, monasteries and glaciers, underground cities and future halls. I wrote them not as instructions, but as invitations, not to worship, but to listen. Somewhere, in a temple whose roof had fallen centuries before I was born, dust stirred. In a drowned stairwell, a ripple passed through water, older than any of my words. In a mountain hall of empty shells, the air seemed, for a moment, to hold its breath. And in the great cathedral without walls, the slow, turning architecture of time itself, a note sounded, very small, but very clear, and went on ringing long after my pen lifted from the page. What really happened to JFK? The secrets hidden for 60 years. The sun hung warm and bright over Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, as though unaware that history was preparing to fracture. The presidential motorcade glided through the streets, waving crowds, leaning over barricades, the air shimmering with the excitement that followed President John F. Kennedy wherever he traveled. His open-top limousine reflected sunlight like a promise. a sense that the country stood on the edge of a new, confident era. The cheering was so loud that most would later recall it as a kind of continuous roar. Until it wasn't. At 12:30 p.m., the world broke. 3 sharp cracks cut through the noise, dissonant and metallic. Some thought they were firecrackers. Others thought they were motorcycle backfires. But the way the president's body lurched, the way Jacqueline Kennedy reached toward him in a movement both desperate and confused, made the truth impossible to deny. The limousine accelerated. Governor Connolly slumped in agony, and within minutes they were racing toward Parkland Memorial Hospital. The president would not leave it alive. The shock that spread through the country was immediate and paralyzing. People gathered around televisions and radios, their faces pale with disbelief. When Walter Cronkite removed his glasses and announced that Kennedy had died, a silence fell across the nation. A silence steeped not just in grief, but in a dawning sense that something colossal and incomprehensible had unfolded in Dallas. Within an hour, a name had surfaced. Lee Harvey Oswald, a former Marine who had defected to the Soviet Union and returned to the United States with a Russian wife. Police said he had fired the shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. The story came quickly, cleanly, almost too neatly for some observers. Oswald himself famously insisted, "I'm just a patsy." He claimed he had been arrested not for murder, but for something larger, something he could not explain before he was gunned down 2 days later in the basement of the Dallas police headquarters by nightclub owner Jack Ruby. Those 2 bullets, the ones that killed Kennedy and the one that killed Oswald, created a vacuum. Into that vacuum poured speculation, suspicion, and the uneasy feeling that the truth had splintered into pieces scattered across agencies, rivalries, and darkened rooms. The Warren Commission, assembled quickly in the aftermath, concluded in 1964 that Oswald acted alone. A single gunman, a single rifle. 3 shots. One man capable of altering the world's course. Yet almost immediately, reports, testimonies, and photographs raised questions. Witnesses said they heard shots from the grassy knoll. Doctors at Parkland described a wound in Kennedy's throat that looked like an entrance wound, not an exit. Records were sealed. Autopsy materials vanished or were replaced. Intelligence agencies were evasive, offering half answers and contradictory statements. It was as if the story had been stitched together and someone had pulled at the thread. As the decades passed, small leaks and partial disclosures kept the mystery alive. The Church Committee in the 1970s revealed wrongdoing in the CIA and FBI, unauthorized surveillance, plots to assassinate foreign leaders, and programs so secret that even their existence had been denied under oath. The committee's findings didn't prove a conspiracy in Dallas, but they indicated a pattern. A government willing to conceal, manipulate, and obscure. In 1992, Congress passed the JFK Records Collection Act, promising that by October 2017, all remaining assassination-related documents would be made public. The country waited. Historians waited. Families waited. But when the deadline arrived, thousands of files were withheld again, this time under the justification of national security. The secrecy didn't silence speculation, it amplified it. What, people wondered, could still be so dangerous more than 50 years later? Meanwhile, researchers combed through the files that were released. Memos about Oswald's trips to Mexico City, surveillance reports on pro- and anti-Castro groups, warnings about threats to the president in Miami and Chicago, and details about individuals with intelligence ties who just happened to be in Dallas that day. Patterns emerged, strange coincidences, names that overlapped, but still, nothing definitive. The assassination became less a single event and more a landscape. A maze with shadows that shifted depending on where one stood. The official narrative remained, but so did the unanswered questions, the inconsistencies, the sudden deaths of witnesses, the missing records. As the country moved into the 2020s, calls for transparency intensified. Families of officials, historians, journalists, and even former intelligence officers urged the government to finally release the complete record. They argued that the last living individuals involved, though directly or indirectly, were now elderly or deceased. The Cold War was long over. The public deserved clarity. In 2022, another wave of documents was released, but still thousands remain classified or redacted. The National Archives cited agency objections. The CIA insisted that disclosure would compromise sources and methods that, remarkably, were still considered sensitive decades after the events. But then came the turning point. An independent panel of archivists, historians, and national security experts recommended the full release of all remaining files by mid-2025. Their argument was simple. The public interest outweighed any remaining national security concern. Pressure mounted. Requests from Congress grew. Public accountability became politically urgent. And then, quietly, steadily, the countdown to 2025 began. In the months leading up to the deadline, rumors swirled. Analysts whispered about a handful of documents, the so-called core files, that had never seen daylight. They were believed to include late 1963 communications between the CIA, FBI, and military intelligence units, intercepts from Mexico City, and a memo written shortly after Oswald's death that reportedly referenced something called the Contingency Monitoring Program. What this program was, no one knew, but its existence alone suggested a layer of observation or planning that had never been acknowledged. The president at the time signaled his intention to honor the deadline. It was a moment decades in the making. Archivists began preparing documents for release, scanning, reviewing, cataloguing. Agencies reluctantly cooperated, facing mounting pressure from Congress. By early 2025, the anticipation was palpable. Not because people expected a dramatic smoking gun, most experts doubted such a document existed, but because the mosaic was finally nearing completion. Thousands of pieces, scattered for more than 60 years, were about to be placed on the table at once. The truth, whatever it was, had been waiting beneath decades of secrecy, speculation, and conflicting narratives, and the world was finally ready to see it. The final releases of 2025 were more than just documents. They were the last breaths of a moment frozen in national memory. And as researchers sifted through the enormous archive, another layer of the narrative emerged. Not one of villainy, but of unintended tragedy woven through bureaucracy, caution, and Cold War paranoia. Every page seemed to echo the same message. The assassination was not just an event, but a collision of forces, each acting independently, each leaving a trail of confusion in its wake. Among the newly unsealed files were extensive interagency debates from the weeks following the assassination. The tone of these internal memos was frantic. Officials from the FBI, CIA, and military intelligence argued over how much to disclose, not only to investigators, but to each other. The fear of war with the Soviet Union, a fear that had defined nearly every political decision of the early 1960s, permeated every sentence. Leaders worried that if the public believed Kennedy had been killed by someone linked to Moscow or Havana, the calls for retaliation would be overwhelming. One memo written by a mid-level intelligence officer in late November 1963 revealed a haunting truth. Some officials believed that acknowledging their own pre-assassination awareness of Oswald's movements could be seen as gross negligence. They feared it would destroy public trust in national security institutions. And so, they lobbied to narrow the story, not to hide a conspiracy, but to hide their own failures. The 2025 declassification showed that these competing motivations led to fragmented communication. The Warren Commission received summaries instead of original files. Agencies withheld documents from each other, not out of malice, but because each believed the other could misinterpret or misuse sensitive intelligence. In some cases, officers simply feared political consequences. The truth was fractured before investigators ever arrived in Dallas. Perhaps the most surprising revelation in the 2025 files was the extent to which foreign intelligence agencies were monitoring events in the United States. At the time, newly unsealed diplomatic cables from the Soviet Union, Mexico, and several European nations showed that foreign governments were also scrambling to understand Oswald's motives. Soviet messages revealed deep alarm after the assassination. One cable, written within hours of the president's death, warned that if the United States believed Moscow had played any role, World War III could erupt within days. Soviet leaders issued urgent orders to purge any references to Oswald in their own intelligence files, fearing even innocent records could be misinterpreted. The result was an international chain reaction of secrecy. Nations were hiding details from each other, not to protect guilt, but to avoid catastrophic misunderstanding. The global landscape was so tense that even factual clarity carried risk. Yet the most poignant part of the 2025 release was not the political memos or interagency disputes. It was the personal reflections. Hidden for decades in classified archives were handwritten notes, private letters, and diary entries from investigators, military officers, and even White House staffers. Their words painted a picture of a government in mourning, confused, overwhelmed, and terrified of making the wrong move. One letter from a Secret Service agent assigned to the Dallas motorcade described the sleepless nights that followed. He wrote that he replayed the event in his mind every day, wondering what he could have changed. The route, the speed of the limousine, the position of officers on the running boards. His letter was never meant for the public. It was addressed to no one, found decades later in an archive box simply labeled Personal Correspondence, Restricted. Another set of documents showed the frantic internal debate over Kennedy's autopsy. Newly declassified medical reports revealed the pressure military pathologists faced as they attempted to reconcile contradictory wounds while keeping certain national security concerns in mind. Their notes showed uncertainty, not deceit. They were doctors caught in the middle of a security crisis. They had not been trained to navigate their early drafts, filled with crossed-out minds and rewritten observations, painted a picture of professionals under extraordinary pressure, working without complete information, their every decision scrutinized by higher authorities, As the public absorbed these details in 2025, the narrative of the assassination began to shift. The picture that emerged was neither the clean lone gunman story, nor the grand conspiracy many had imagined. Instead, it was a mosaic of human limitations. Fragmented intelligence, geopolitical fear, institutional caution, and a chain of events that spiraled faster than any agency could control. The newly released files also shed light on the infamous Mexico City episode, long considered one of the murkiest elements of the case. The 2025 documents confirmed a long-suspected truth. Intelligence agencies never fully understood who the Oswald was, who appeared in surveillance photos from the Cuban and Soviet consulates. The files indicated that several officers privately believed the photographed man was not Lee Harvey Oswald at all, but an unidentified individual who resembled him. Why this person visited those consulates, why they used Oswald's name, and whether the real Oswald ever interacted with him, none of these questions were definitively answered, but the documents made one fact clear. Confusion in Mexico City led to misjudgments in Washington. Intelligence officers downplayed the inconsistencies after the assassination, hoping to avoid accusations of incompetence. Their efforts to simplify the narrative contributed to decades of confusion. A separate batch of files revealed extensive surveillance of Cuban exile groups operating within the United States. These groups, deeply opposed to Fidel Castro, were involved in numerous plots, some sanctioned by US intelligence, others rogue operations. In the weeks before Dallas, several members of these groups were traveling through Texas, including one individual whose newly revealed FBI file noted that he had been near Dealey Plaza in early November 1963. The 2025 files did not link him to the assassination, but they confirmed that multiple politically volatile figures were moving through Dallas at the same time, complicating the intelligence picture and fueling later speculation. Still, nothing in the 2025 files suggested that these individuals acted together or that they orchestrated Kennedy's death. Instead, the documents painted a portrait of a region filled with political tension, where many unrelated actors were operating simultaneously under the shadow of Cold War anxieties. One of the most powerful revelations from the 2025 release was the extent of internal disagreement within the CIA. Newly unsealed transcripts from closed-door discussions showed that some officers believed from the start that Oswald's background made him a potential threat. He was unpredictable, frustrated, and searching for identity. Others saw him as insignificant, a man whose political interests were inconsistent and poorly formed. These conflicting assessments were never reconciled, and no single office took full responsibility for monitoring him. The siloed structure of intelligence agencies meant that pieces of the puzzle remained scattered. One unit knew he had defected to the Soviet Union, another knew he had returned, another tracked his involvement in pro-Castro activities, and another recorded his visit to embassies in Mexico City. No one had the full picture. 2025 files revealed the chilling truth. Even if agencies had wanted to stop Oswald, the disjointed structure of intelligence at the time made it nearly impossible. Their systems were built for the Cold War, not for lone actors whose motives fell between political categories. Oswald was neither a Soviet agent nor a Cuban asset, neither a loyal Marine nor a stable civilian. He was, as one analyst wrote in a note discovered in the new release, a man who slipped through every crack we had. Perhaps the most unexpected documents in the release concern the days immediately after the assassination, when Lyndon B. Johnson assumed the presidency. Newly unsealed communications revealed that Johnson privately worried that early evidence pointed toward foreign involvement. He feared that if the public interpreted the assassination as an act of war, the nation would demand retaliation before the truth could be fully understood. His private recordings, some transcribed for the first time in 2025, showed a man deeply aware of how fragile the geopolitical balance was. His urgency to create a single, stable narrative was driven not by deceit, but by national fear. These recordings showed Johnson repeatedly urging caution, warning that any premature conclusion could escalate into conflict. Some conversations revealed that he believed the Warren Commission's primary responsibility was to reassure the public, even if that meant simplifying the darker, more complicated edges of the truth. The Commission, composed of men who themselves feared the potential consequences of their findings, leaned into that sense of duty. Not to hide a conspiracy, but to maintain stability. The documents released in 2025 also contained fragments of testimony and interviews that had never been seen outside of classified rooms. Some of these statements were withheld for decades because they contradicted or complicated the Commission's findings. One interview with a federal agent suggested that witnesses who claimed to hear shots from multiple directions may have been influenced by the chaotic acoustics of Dealey Plaza. Another suggested that early photographic analysis had been inconsistent due to unreliable equipment and rushed development procedures. The release of these files did not resolve the long-standing debates over ballistics or trajectories, but they offered clarity. Confusion, not conspiracy, shaped much of the early evidence. Perhaps the most humanizing documents in the release were the letters written by Jacqueline Kennedy in the months following the assassination. While most of her personal correspondence remained sealed for privacy, a few previously classified notes concerning security matters were made public in 2025. In them, she expressed not only grief but also frustration at the conflicting reports she received from officials. She struggled to reconcile accounts of the assassination, medical findings, and the limited information she was given. Her letters revealed a woman seeking truth amid obscured narratives, a reminder that even those closest to the tragedy were left with unanswered questions. As historians worked through the extensive release, a unified picture finally began to emerge. It was not perfect, it was not simple, but it was grounded in evidence that had been scattered and withheld for over 6 decades. The assassination was now understood not as a clear-cut case of lone action or elaborate conspiracy, but as a moment where human error, geopolitical fear, institutional pressure, and fragmented intelligence collided in a single point of failure. The truth was not hidden because it was sinister. It was hidden because it was chaotic. 2025 files showed that agencies had been overwhelmed, under-coordinated, and fearful of consequences that ranged from political embarrassment to nuclear war. They simplified because complexity was dangerous. They redacted because uncertainty looked like guilt. They hid their own contradictions because admitting them could have shattered public trust during the most dangerous era of the Cold War. Yet now, with the full release, the public could finally see the assassination as history, not myth. It remained tragic, confusing, and emotionally charged, but it was no longer obscured by silence. In the end, the declassified files of 2025 did not provide a dramatic revelation. They provided something more valuable: Context. They showed that the truth of November 22nd, 1963 was not a single story, but a tapestry woven from fear, miscommunication, secrecy, and the limits of institutions caught in crisis. The shadows that had surrounded the assassination for more than 60 years were not populated by sinister figures. They were populated by ordinary people facing extraordinary pressure. As the last pages were unsealed and the final memos uploaded, the weight of history lifted slightly. The nation, at long last, could look back on the tragedy, not through the haze of speculation, but through the clearer light of understanding. And with that clarity came something long overdue. The quiet, solemn closing of a chapter that had remained open for generations.